Winter has a way of exposing the truth. Not through drama or noise, but through silence. When temperatures plunge, when heat drains from your body faster than you can replace it, comfort becomes a memory, and survival becomes a calculation. History offers one of the clearest warnings of this physics at work. In the winter of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, American soldiers weren't losing ground to enemy fire, they were losing their own feet. Frostbite swept through entire units. Toes turned black. Boots froze solid. The cold became a weapon more ruthless than artillery. Yet a small group of seasoned soldiers managed to endure. They didn't have better gear. They didn't have new boots. What they had was a forgotten principle, an understanding of heat, moisture, and human physiology that modern equipment often ignores. Using scraps of waxed paper, grease, and a clever manipulation of vapor and insulation, they protected themselves where official gear failed. Today, their lesson matters more than ever, because in a winter power outage, your blankets won't save you if you misunderstand how heat actually works. Warmth isn't about piling on layers, it's about controlling moisture, airflow, and the physics that your body cannot negotiate with. Welcome to Historia Prime. This is the forgotten World War II survival hack that still applies inside your own home when the lights go out and the cold begins to wait. Part 1. The Trap of 1944. To understand the hack that saved lives, we first have to understand the trap that destroyed them. In late 1944, the Allied campaign in Europe was riding on a dangerous wave of optimism. The breakout from Normandy had succeeded. France was being liberated. And inside the high command, men like Eisenhower and Bradley truly believed, that the German war machine was collapsing. They predicted the war would be over by Christmas. That belief came with a price. Logistics across the continent was stretched thin. Supplies moved slower than armies. Every convoy, every cargo plane, every ship had to make a choice. Deliver ammunition and gasoline to keep the advance alive, or deliver winter gear to keep the soldiers alive. Command chose ammo. They chose fuel. They chose momentum over preparation, speed over safety. They gambled that victory would arrive before winter did. They were wrong. When Hitler launched his desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the weather shifted from cold to catastrophic. Europe plunged into one of its harshest winters in 30 years. Snow fell in sheets, mud froze into iron, and into this frozen crucible walked the American GI, wearing the M1943 combat boot. On paper it sounded modern, an upgrade from the old ankle boots and canvas leggings. A thick sole, a taller leather upper, a design meant to unify protection and mobility. But the battlefield does not care about design on paper. In the slush and freezing rain of Belgium, that leather became a liability. It absorbed water, it held moisture, and when soldiers coated it in dubbing, a wax waterproofing paste, it didn't keep the water out, it simply trapped sweat inside. This wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. During the European campaign, cold injuries claimed roughly 71,000 American casualties. That is the equivalent of wiping 5 full infantry divisions off the map, erased without a single shot fired. In some units, trench foot took more soldiers out of the fight than German machine guns. And beneath that staggering number lies a single devastating truth. The boots were built on a lie. The lie that leather keeps you warm. Leather doesn't warm you. Leather doesn't insulate you. Leather conducts cold, absorbs moisture, and freezes into a shell that steals heat faster than your body can replace it. This was the trap of 1944. A trap born from optimism, speed, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how cold really kills. And unless we understand that physics, we won't understand why your blankets alone won't save you in a winter power outage. But a simple hack will. Part 2. The Physics of Failure. Now we step into the heart of the problem, because survival, in 1944 and in your living room during a winter blackout, always comes down to physics. Before the hack makes sense, we need to understand why the soldiers' boots failed so catastrophically. Most people believe insulation creates warmth, but insulation does nothing of the sort. Wool isn't warm. Down isn't warm. Synthetic fill isn't warm. What they do is far more subtle. They trap still, dry air. And dry air is one of the greatest insulators in the universe. It resists movement. It slows heat loss. It protects you simply by refusing to let warmth escape. But water? Water is a traitor. The moment insulation becomes wet, everything changes. Water conducts heat 25 times faster than air. It grabs your body heat and rushes it away like a thief. This is exactly what happened to the soldier in 1944. He marched, his muscles worked, his core temperature rose, and his feet, held tight inside leather, began to sweat. This isn't weakness. This isn't preventable. It's human biology. Your feet contain more sweat glands per square inch than almost any other part of your body. Inside a leather boot, that sweat had nowhere to go. It migrated outward into the wool sock. Under normal temperatures, this might not have been a disaster, but in the sub-zero cold of the Bulge, a deadly thermodynamic boundary formed inside the boot. It's called the dew point. The dew point is the exact layer inside your clothing where warm vapor hits cold air and turns back into liquid. In extreme cold, that line doesn't form on the outside of your boot, it forms inside your sock. And that single detail doomed thousands of men. The sweat vapor condensed in the wool soaked. Its delicate air pockets collapsed. Then the moisture froze solid. At that moment, the soldier wasn't wearing insulation anymore. He was wearing a block of ice shaped like his own foot. His body heat attempted to melt that ice, but conduction, the fastest, most merciless form of heat loss, pulled warmth out faster than his metabolism could replace it. In effect, he had created a closed-circuit refrigeration system around his own toes, a freezer he couldn't step out of. This is why soldiers were losing limbs. They weren't careless, they weren't underprepared. They were following the logic of breathable gear, a logic we still believe today. But in deep cold, breathability becomes a trap. Moisture cannot escape fast enough, so it freezes in the very insulation meant to protect you. And here is the bridge to your home, your blankets, your winter outage. If moisture moves into your insulation, any insulation, it destroys it. Boots, jackets, sleeping bags, blankets, even the air inside your clothing system all obey this same law. When the temperature drops below a critical point, staying dry is no longer about keeping moisture off your skin. It's about keeping moisture out of your insulation. Because once your insulation becomes wet, it stops insulating. And once it stops insulating, the cold wins. This is the physics of failure, on the battlefield and in your own home when the power goes out. Part 3. The Lost Hack, the Vapor Barrier. So how did the veterans survive when so many others didn't? How did the men who had marched through North Africa or grown up in the frozen winters of Minnesota and Michigan keep their toes when the newcomers were losing theirs overnight? They did something completely counterintuitive. They stopped trying to keep their feet dry and instead focused on keeping their insulation dry. This is the core of what we now call the vapor barrier principle. It sounds almost absurd at first because it goes against everything we've been taught about cold weather. But in the physics of deep winter, it is brutally effective. The principle is simple. You trap sweat directly against your skin so it never reaches your insulation. The veterans built this system out of whatever they could find, and what they created was a masterpiece of field engineering, one you can still use today. The first step was the grease layer. Soldiers coated their bare feet with anything slick and waterproof. Medics' foot oil when they had it, rifle grease when they didn't, animal fat when they got creative, even axle grease when desperation hit. This wasn't for warmth. This protected the skin from maceration, the painful breakdown that happens when skin stays wet for days. Grease made the foot waterproof. It turned the skin into a barrier. The second step was the sacrificial liner. They pulled on a thin cotton or rayon sock, not for warmth, but simply to hold the grease in place. This layer absorbed the mess, so the vapor barrier could sit smoothly on top of it. Then came the critical step, the barrier itself. The soldiers didn't have Gore-Tex, they didn't have modern sealed membranes, so they improvised with wartime trash. Waxed paper from K-ration boxes, rubberized artillery bags, cut-up waterproof maps, even the cellophane from cigarette packs. Anything that sweat vapor couldn't pass through became a life-saving tool. They wrapped this layer tightly around the liner. And finally, step 4, insulation. Only after creating this sealed inner climate did they pull heavy wool socks over the barrier. The physics here is elegant. Your foot sweats. The vapor moves outward until it hits the waxed paper. Then it stops. It cannot escape. It cannot soak into the wool. The outer sock stays completely dry, so its air pockets stay intact. That means the wool keeps its full insulating power. It never freezes. It never collapses. It keeps heat exactly where you need it. Inside the barrier, something surprising happens. As the humidity rises to saturation, your body stops sweating as much. The microclimate stabilizes into a warm, damp environment. Not comfortable, but survivable. You trade the feeling of dry skin for the far more important reality of warm blood circulating to your toes. This system felt strange. It felt wrong. But it worked, again and again, while standard gear failed. Because survival isn't about comfort. It's about understanding physics well enough to break the cold's advantage. And just like those soldiers in 1944, anyone facing a winter power outage can use this same principle. When the temperature drops and blankets are no longer enough, the vapor barrier becomes not just a trick, but a lifeline. Part 4. The Cardboard Secret. The vapor barrier kept the soldiers' insulation dry, but it still didn't solve the second assassin in the foxhole, the cold rising from below. If evaporation was the silent thief, then conduction was the executioner. Standing in a foxhole meant standing on frozen earth. And frozen earth is not just cold, it is effectively infinite in mass. It will drink the heat from your body without ever warming up itself. The M1943 combat boots, with their thin rubber soles, offered almost no resistance. The ground didn't just chill the soldiers' feet, it pulled the warmth out of them relentlessly until flesh reached the temperature of soil. The soldiers soon realized something crucial. The danger wasn't only what cold could do to them, it was what they were giving away. Heat wasn't just being attacked, it was escaping through the bottom of the boot. They needed a barrier, not against wind or snow, but against the ground itself. And once again, the solution didn't come from equipment manuals or supply depots. It came from trash. Corrugated cardboard. Supply boxes littered the rear lines, and inside that scrap material lay a hidden engineering marvel. The wavy channels inside cardboard trap pockets of dead air, the same principle behind modern insulated foam pads. Veterans began cutting out layers of cardboard shaped like their boot soles. Not one layer, several. Layer upon layer of captured air stood between their skin and the frozen earth. And it worked. With the cardboard inserted, the conduction slowed. Heat loss dropped. Toes began to stay warmer longer. A few resourceful units took the idea even further. Some stuffed boots with dried grass. Others used newspaper, crumpled just enough to hold tiny air pockets. The legendary 30th Infantry Division even made makeshift booties out of shredded wool blankets to wear inside their rubber overshoes. These improvised liners lifted the foot away from the cold sole, breaking the deadly thermal bridge. Every one of these tricks had the same goal: create a thermal break, an interruption in the pathway where heat leaks directly into the ground. Because in extreme cold, survival isn't about trapping heat alone, it's about refusing to let the earth steal it. And the lesson echoes straight into the modern home during a winter power outage. When your floor becomes a cold slab, when blankets no longer help because the heat is draining downward, you don't need more layers on top. You need a barrier below: cardboard, a yoga mat, a folded towel, a spare jacket. Anything with trapped air becomes a shield against conduction. It doesn't just help, it can be the difference between shivering through the night and conserving enough warmth to endure until sunrise. Once again, what saved soldiers in the Ardennes is exactly what can keep you alive in your living room when the lights go out. Part 5. The Lacing Protocol. There was one final element in this survival system, and it is the one nearly everyone gets wrong, even today. When the cold bites, our instinct is to tighten everything. We zip up, cinch down, pull straps and laces until nothing can move. It feels logical. If the cold is outside, we want to seal ourselves inside. But in deep winter, that instinct can cost you your toes. Because tight boots don't keep you warm. Tight boots cut off your heat supply. Every degree of warmth your feet ever receive comes from one source only: your own blood. If you restrict circulation, even slightly, your toes are no longer being heated. No amount of wool, no amount of blankets, no miracle fabric can compensate for blocked blood flow. The veterans of 1944 learned this through bitter experience. They discovered that warmth didn't come from squeezing the boot tighter. It came from letting the foot live inside the boot. So they adopted a lacing method that went against every regulation, every handbook, every instinct. They skipped the bottom 3 eyelets entirely, leaving the toe box wide open. The boot looked almost sloppy, but that looseness served a purpose. It allowed the toes to wiggle freely, and that movement produced kinetic heat, tiny bursts of internal warmth that kept capillaries alive. More importantly, it allowed warm, oxygen-rich blood to reach all the way to the tips of the toes. No pressure, no restriction, no internal tourniquet created by ambition or fear. To the veterans, a loose boot was not negligence, it was engineering. Combined with a cardboard thermal break and a vapor barrier system, a relaxed, flexible lacing pattern completed a trifecta of survival. A tight, pristine, factory-perfect boot. That was a coffin made of leather. And the lesson applies far beyond wartime. During a winter power outage, people instinctively bundle so tightly that blood flow slows. Socks layered until circulation struggles. Blankets pinned around limbs until the extremities go numb. Warmth doesn't come from squeezing. Warmth comes from flow. Your feet, your hands, your core all depend on your blood delivering heat where it's needed. If the system is strangled, the warmth is gone. What the soldiers learned, through pain, through frostbite, through nights when survival was never guaranteed, is that the body must be allowed to move, breathe, and circulate. Cold steals your heat from the outside, but constriction kills it from the inside. And when the power goes out, when the temperature drops, and when instinct tells you to tighten everything, remember what actually kept those veterans alive. Not tension, but freedom. Not pressure, but circulation. Not the perfect boot, but the perfect system. Part 6. The Mickey Mouse Legacy. The lessons learned in the Ardennes were written in frostbite, amputations, and human suffering. But they were not lost. They evolved. When the war ended, the US Army sifted through casualty reports. Page after page of cold injuries, thousands of soldiers maimed not by bullets, but by thermodynamics. and the uncomfortable truth became impossible to ignore. The improvised boot hacks used by exhausted infantrymen, the grease, the vapor barrier, the cardboard, had outperformed official military equipment. The soldiers' field ingenuity wasn't a workaround, it was an upgrade, and that revelation changed military history. It led directly to the creation of one of the most iconic pieces of cold weather gear ever issued, the Extreme Cold Vapor Barrier Boot. Most people know it by its nickname, the Mickey Mouse Boot, or in its white Arctic version, the Bunny Boot. Look closely at one today and you'll see it immediately. This is not a normal boot. It is the factory-made, military-standard version of the World War II foxhole hack. The entire boot is rubber, fully impermeable. No vapor escapes, no moisture enters. Inside those rubber walls, sealed forever, is a thick layer of insulation, traditionally wool, locked away from sweat, snow, and melting ice. The insulation stays dry for the entire lifetime of the boot. In other words, the Bunny Boot is a thermos for your feet. The boot is sealed so tightly that it has a pressure valve on the side. Pilots have to open the valve before takeoff because during flight, the trapped air inside the insulation will expand with altitude. If the valve stays closed, the boot can literally burst apart. That's how airtight, how uncompromising the design is. And here's the incredible part. In deep Arctic expeditions, where temperatures plunge to levels that kill exposed skin in minutes, modern high-tech boots marketed with breathable membranes, advanced foams, and space-age textiles, still fail where the clunky, cartoonish Bunny Boot quietly succeeds. Why? Because the Bunny Boot respects the physics of moisture. It understands that insulation is only insulation when it stays dry. It recognizes that breathability in extreme cold is not a feature, it is a liability. And it proves, decades later, that a principle born in muddy foxholes can outperform the newest gear on the shelf. This legacy matters far beyond the battlefield, because when your home loses heat during a winter power outage, the same rule applies. Moisture control is the real battlefield. Warmth is not about piling on more layers or buying newer fabrics. Warmth is about understanding where heat escapes, how moisture sabotages insulation, and why the simplest hacks, once used to save soldiers' lives, can still protect yours. In the cold, physics always wins. But if you understand it, you can win too. Part 7. Modern Survival Application. So why does any of this matter to you? You're not standing in a frozen foxhole in 1944. You're not fighting in the Ardennes. But the truth is simple. The laws of thermodynamics don't care who you are or what century you live in. Cold behaves the same way in a war zone, on a mountain trail, or inside your house during a winter power outage. If you hike, if you hunt, if you camp, or if you simply live in a place where the grid can fail, then this lost hack is not a historical curiosity. It is a tool, a strategy, a survival mechanism. We live in an age of breathable marketing. Every tag, every jacket, every boot promises miracles with phrases like moisture wicking, climate adaptive, and engineered airflow. And for moderate cold, during active movement, these technologies do help. But survival is not moderate, and it is not active. Real survival often means sitting still, with no heat source, in temperatures far below freezing, and with no way to dry anything once it gets wet. In that environment, breathability becomes a liability. Moisture escaping slowly is still moisture escaping. Moisture escaping slowly is still moisture freezing inside your insulation. The physics do not bend for brand names, and that is where the WW2 hack comes back to life. If you ever find yourself in extreme cold and your feet begin to numb, don't add more socks until your boots are tight. Tightness kills circulation and guarantees frostbite. Instead, use the vapor barrier. Use what veterans called the bread bag trick. Put on a thin synthetic liner sock, slip a plastic bread bag or even a produce bag over it. Then pull your heavy wool sock on top. It will feel clammy at first. It will feel wrong. But within minutes, the evaporative cooling stops. The wool stays dry. The heat stabilizes. The temperature inside your boot rises because the physics has been corrected. Your foot becomes a warm, humid microclimate, protected from the enemy outside. The same logic applies beneath your feet. Check your insoles. If they are thin foam, they are not protecting you from anything. If you're standing on ice or concrete in a blackout, remove them. Cut a piece from a cheap blue camping mat, or even use a folded scrap of cardboard. Slip it under your foot. You have just created a thermal break, the same kind that saved soldiers from frostbite in the Ardennes. Small actions, simple materials, massive impact, because survival in extreme cold is never about high-tech gear. It is about controlling moisture. It is about protecting insulation, and it is about understanding that your body heat is both the fuel and the furnace. When the power goes out and the temperature drops, your blankets won't save you if moisture wins. But a vapor barrier and a thermal break, tricks born in the harshest winter of World War II, just might. Part 8. The psychological factor. There is one final lesson from the Ardennes, one that mattered more than cardboard, more than vapor barriers, more than any piece of gear. It was discipline. Not the kind printed in manuals, but the kind that separates survival from collapse. In the units that recorded almost no frostbite casualties, their commanders were relentless. General George Patton himself issued a standing order. Every man would massage his feet and change his socks every single day, even under fire. He understood what many didn't, that frozen feet don't just hurt morale, they end the ability to march. They end the ability to fight. A soldier with dead toes becomes dead weight, and dead weight becomes a danger to the entire unit. And here is where the real challenge begins. Because the hack, as brilliant as it was, demanded mental toughness. It required men to take off their boots in the bitter cold, expose bare skin to freezing air, and rub warmth back into their numb feet. It required the discipline to pull off wet socks and dry them, not by a fire, not in a warm tent, but against their own chest as they slept. This method, known quietly among soldiers as body warmth dry, was misery incarnate. You take an icy, half-frozen sock, you press it to your stomach. Every instinct screams to pull away. But if you endure that discomfort for a few minutes, something remarkable happens. Your body heat gently drives moisture out of the wool, and by morning, the sock is dry enough to insulate again. A small misery now, or a catastrophe later. That was always the choice. Survival in the cold is never painless. It asks you to embrace discomfort, to do the thing you don't want to do, to act before the danger becomes irreversible. And that lesson applies just as much to a modern winter blackout as it did to a WW2 foxhole. When the temperature drops inside your home, you will feel the instinct to curl up, tighten your layers, stay perfectly still, and hope the cold passes. But survival is not passive. It is disciplined. It is intentional. It is the accumulation of small, uncomfortable actions that keep disaster just far enough away. In the end, the soldiers in the Ardennes didn't out-muscle winter. They out-disciplined it. And the same mindset, steady, uncomfortable, deliberate, can be the difference between enduring a winter power outage and being overwhelmed by it. Conclusion. History is a survival manual. The Battle of the Bulge was decided by artillery, by tanks, and by the unbreakable resolve of men like the 101st Airborne surrounded at Bastogne. But in the shadows of that history, there is another truth, quieter, humbler, and just as critical. Victory was also won by waxed paper, by cardboard, by scraps of field rations and improvised insulation, by soldiers who refused to accept that their gear, as issued, was the limit of what kept them alive. When we look back at history, It's tempting to zoom out, to see only arrows on maps and the decisions of generals. But when you get close, when you stand eye level with the men who fought, you see that survival often hinged on the simplest objects used in the smartest ways. A piece of trash became a lifeline. A thin layer of paper became a shield. A handful of cardboard became the difference between frostbite and one more day of marching. And that is the lesson that matters now, in your world, in your home, especially when the power goes out in the dead of winter. Because the next time you lace up your boots or bundle under blankets during a blackout, you need to remember the lost hack. Remember that dryness is the real source of warmth. Remember that insulation must stay dry, even if your skin does not. Remember that vapor is the invisible enemy that destroys warmth from the inside out. And remember that the physics that governed a frozen battlefield in 1944 still govern your living room today. History is not just a record of what happened, it is a manual for what to do when things go wrong. It is written in blood, refined by necessity, and waiting for us to bother reading it. If you found meaning in this journey through forgotten survival wisdom, if these lessons gave you a new way to think about cold, insulation, and the fragility of warmth, then make sure you hit the subscribe button and ring the bell. We have many more stories of ingenuity under fire coming your way. This is Historia Prime, signing off. Stay sharp, stay prepared, and above all, stay warm out there.